a paralyzed billionaire, a poor maid, and a smile that started a war. Ethan Hawthorne was once the most powerful man in America, a self-made billionaire, the founder of a technology empire worth tens of billions of dollars, a man who had never lost at anything in his entire life. Then one rainy night, a car accident stole the use of his body, and the world he had built began disappearing around him, piece by piece, signature by signature, while he sat trapped in a wheelchair, unable to stop it. For 3 long years, no doctor healed him. No therapist reached him. The woman he planned to marry walked away. His own family declared the light had gone out of his eyes forever. And inside the most expensive mansion in the city, surrounded by luxury that meant nothing, Ethan Hawthorne became a prisoner in his own life, slowly being medicated into silence by people who smiled at his face and stole from his hands. Then an exhausted young maid named Grace Carter, a woman who had sacrificed her nursing education, her savings, and her sleep to keep her sick mother alive and her little brother fed, accidentally fell asleep beside his bed while holding his hand. She wasn't performing kindness. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply too tired to pretend anymore. And when Ethan opened his eyes and saw her there, something the medication had buried for 3 years cracked open inside his chest. He smiled. One small, real, unguarded smile, and it triggered a conspiracy that powerful people had spent 3 years and millions of dollars keeping buried. Now the questions that will drive everything forward are these. Why has Ethan been medicated into silence, and who gave the order? What really happened on the night of that accident, and was it truly an accident at all? Why does Grace Carter, a woman with no money and no connections, feel strangely linked to a world she was never supposed to enter? And how long before the people watching from the shadows decide that one poor maid has seen far too much to be allowed to simply walk away? Stay with me, because the story you are about to witness is not simply a love story between a billionaire and a maid. It is a story about what happens when ordinary people stumble into extraordinary crimes and refuse to look away. Grace Carter had survived 24 years of life by learning one essential truth. The moment you start noticing things you were never meant to see, you become someone that dangerous people need to manage. She understood this the way poor people understand most important things, not from a book, not from a classroom, but from experience that left permanent marks on the soul. She was not beautiful in the way that wealthy men noticed immediately, not polished, not adorned, not presented. She was beautiful the way determination is beautiful, the way a candle flame is beautiful in a room that has been dark too long. She was 24 years old, slight and careful in her movements, with dark eyes that had developed the habit of noticing small things because her survival had depended on it since she was 19. Her hands were smooth despite the work they did, because she moisturized them every night, not out of vanity, but because her nursing instructors had told her that cracked hands introduced infection risk to patients, and she had never quite let go of the discipline even after she stopped being a student. She had been forced to stop being a student the morning her mother collapsed on the factory floor. Emily Carter had worked as a seamstress for 11 years, hunched over industrial machines in a poorly ventilated building that paid just enough to keep the family in their 2-bedroom apartment, and not $1 more. She was a woman who had raised 2 children alone after her husband's death, who had never once asked anyone for help she hadn't first tried to refuse, who had told Grace on the morning of her nursing school acceptance that she was the most important thing that had ever happened to their family. When Emily collapsed and the diagnosis came back as advanced kidney disease, Grace had sat in a hospital corridor for 4 hours, not crying, not speaking, simply running the numbers in her head with the cold precision of someone who had always understood that grief was a luxury the poor could not afford to indulge for very long. The nursing school tuition money became dialysis money. The textbooks went into a box under her bed, where they still sat. She had told her mother she was taking a temporary leave. She had told Noah, her 10-year-old brother, that she worked in the biggest, most beautiful hotel in the city, because he had drawn her a picture of it once, a child's crayon rendering of towers and fountains and chandeliers, and the joy on his face had made lying feel like the kindest thing she had ever done. She had carried that lie every day since, tucking it carefully around him the way she tucked his blanket around his small shoulders each night before she collapsed into her own bed. She pulled her cleaning cart now down the east wing corridor of Hawthorne Mansion and reminded herself, with the firmness of someone who had practiced the argument, that she was here for one reason only. The unlabeled syringe refused to let her believe it. She had glimpsed it the previous evening, only a few seconds, an involuntary glance while retrieving a fallen towel near the bedside cabinet. 2 medication trays side by side, one organized and labeled, every bottle bearing a pharmacy watermark and a physician's signature, the way legitimate hospital-grade care always presented itself. And beside it, on a separate tray, a single syringe with nothing on it at all. No label, no identifying mark, nothing. Her pharmacology professor's voice surfaced immediately in her memory, a small, fierce woman named Dr. Ose, who had worn the same reading glasses for 12 years and had zero tolerance for imprecision. An unlabeled syringe in a patient's environment is never a clerical oversight. It is either dangerous incompetence or deliberate concealment. In my 20 years of clinical practice, I have encountered the former exactly once. Grace had been trying to convince herself she was encountering that single exception. The effort was failing badly. The corridor outside Ethan's room was its usual carefully composed self this morning: mahogany double doors, gold fixtures catching the light, a security guard stationed precisely enough to observe arrivals without appearing to obstruct them. The mansion, at its core, was a masterpiece of the appearance of openness. Everything visible, nothing accessible. Grace had been in enough wealthy households during her previous domestic work to recognize the architecture of controlled environments, spaces designed to feel welcoming while functioning as surveillance. This one was simply more expensive than the others. She kept her cart to the right side of the corridor and worked methodically, replacing wilted flowers with the fresh ones she'd collected from the ground floor arrangement station at dawn, dusting the carved frames of 2 oil portraits, both of them Hawthorne ancestors, severe-faced men in dark suits who stared down from the walls with the entitlement of people who had never once questioned whether they deserved what they had. She wiped down the hallway table, straightened an arrangement of decorative books that no one ever read, and kept her breathing even and her mind carefully composed. It was just past noon when the crystal pitcher left her hands and the morning unraveled. Nurse Linda had emerged from Ethan's room at speed, papers pressed to her chest, attention directed entirely inward, and the collision was total. The pitcher swung forward on impact, struck the marble floor, and detonated into fragments with a sound that rang through the quiet corridor like a gunshot in a cathedral. Glass water silence. Then the scramble. Grace dropped to her knees immediately, gathering the larger shards before anyone could step on them. Linda grabbed for her scattered papers with trembling hands, and in the confusion, Linda's elbow caught the edge of the medical cart parked just outside the bedroom door, sending a folder sliding off the top with a slow, inevitable grace, its contents fanning across the wet floor in a wide arc, pages mixing with broken glass and spreading water. Grace gathered them quickly, her apologies continuous and genuine. She had collected 3 pages before her hands went still. The document beneath her fingers carried the letterhead of a private clinic, no registered street address, no state license number, no physician directory listing she could identify from any database her training had introduced her to. The diagnosis line was blank, and the drug listed in the treatment column was a name she could not place, not from any textbook, not from any clinical manual, Not from 2 years of pharmacology study that had required her to memorize over 400 compounds by classification and effect. She read the name twice, subvocalizing it slightly, an old nursing student's habit for committing unfamiliar terminology to memory. That is not for you to read. Linda's hand came down on the folder before Grace could look up. The nurse's voice was shaking, not with professional authority, not with the controlled irritation of someone managing a subordinate, but with something rower and more personal than either. Something Grace had learned to recognize from her hours sitting in hospital corridors, watching people receive news they weren't prepared for. Fear, specific, targeted, and old. I wasn't trying to. Pack your things when your shift ends. Linda's eyes swept the corridor in both directions, fast and sharp, before settling back on Grace with an expression that had abandoned composure completely. You're being reassigned to the laundry wing. Grace straightened slowly. I apologize for the broken pitcher. It was an accident. This is not about the pitcher. Linda pulled the folder against her chest with both arms and stepped backward toward the bedroom door, the movement of someone retreating. Laundry wing, end of shift. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. The door closed. The security guard across the corridor looked carefully at the far wall. The practiced, disciplined blindness of someone who had learned that witnessing things inside Hawthorne Mansion had a personal cost. Grace knelt and finished gathering the glass, placing every shard into the waste bin with the methodical care of someone keeping herself anchored. Her hands did not shake. They had not shaken in a hospital corridor when she was told her mother's prognosis. They had not shaken when she withdrew from nursing school. They did not shake now. But her mind was already pulling the thread. Reassigned, not fired. If she had stumbled across something genuinely dangerous, the rational response was to remove her entirely. A broken pitcher was more than sufficient justification to dismiss a new maid without explanation or legal consequence. Clean and immediate, no one would question it. Reassignment kept her inside the building. Close enough to monitor, far enough from Ethan's corridor to eliminate accidental exposure. It was the calculation of someone who needed her visible and contained, not absent. She stood, straightened her uniform, and pushed her cart forward. Behind the mahogany double doors, through a gap left open no more than 4 inches, a gap Grace had not noticed, positioned at exactly the height of a man who spent his days in a wheelchair. Ethan Hawthorne had tracked every word of the exchange with the fixed, architectural attention of a man who had spent 3 years converting his enforced silence into something extremely precise. He had recognized the private clinic's name the moment Linda's fear had dropped it into the air, not from any legitimate medical directory, but from a financial audit conducted 7 years ago. A shell company, a vehicle for moving money without a paper trail that connected to anything real. He had recognized the drug name from exactly one context. Not a hospital, not a licensed pharmacy, not a clinical trial. A private research division, quietly dissolved and legally buried 4 years ago, its records sealed, its principles scattered, that had been developing pharmaceutical compounds designed to induce long-term cognitive compliance in patients with diminished legal capacity. Compounds engineered not to heal and not merely to sedate, but to produce a specific, sustainable state in which a person could perform complex tasks, like signing documents, like responding coherently to a board member's questions, while remaining unable to consolidate those experiences into reliable long-term memory. Compounds designed, in plain language, to create a man who could be used without being able to testify to having been used. 3 years of carefully cultivated self-doubt collapsed in a single moment. Nothing had broken in him. He had been broken deliberately. The rage that rose in his chest was unlike anything he had felt since the night before the accident. The night he had called Ryan to discuss financial irregularities he discovered in the company's offshore accounts, and Ryan had told him, in a voice entirely too calm for the weight of the accusation, that Ethan must be misreading the reports, that he was overworked, that he should get some rest. He had driven home in the rain. He had never arrived. Ethan composed his face into the familiar blankness, the vacancy that Ryan read as defeat, that Linda read as compliance, that had convinced everyone in this mansion that the man in the wheelchair was no longer dangerous to anyone. Behind it, for the first time in 3 years, he began to plan. And across the corridor, already 3 steps down the hallway with her cart, Grace Carter felt the specific, unmistakable weight of being watched, not by the security guard, whose gaze she could track, but by someone whose attention was different in quality, quieter, more careful. She did not turn around. She had learned, in 24 years of navigating spaces that were not built for people like her, that sometimes the wisest thing a person could do was simply keep walking and remember everything. She would remember everything. Martin Doyle had the face of a man who had not slept properly in 3 years. Not the dramatic, hollow-eyed sleeplessness of grief. He had earned no grief, and some part of him knew it, but the particular grinding exhaustion of someone who had made a decision they could not reverse and had spent every night since replaying the moment of it, searching for the version of events in which they had chosen differently. His eyes carried permanent shadows. His collar was always slightly damp by mid-morning. His hands, which had once moved through boardroom documents with the fluid confidence of a man who had practiced law for 30 years, now had a faint, persistent tremor that he disguised by keeping them occupied at all times. A pen, a briefcase handle, a coffee cup he rarely actually drank from. He was 58 years old and he looked older than that, and he knew it, and he understood precisely what was aging him. He had been the Hawthorne family's attorney for 22 years. He had drafted the original articles of incorporation for Hawthorne Technologies when Ethan was 26 years old and operating out of a converted warehouse with 11 employees and a conviction that bordered on religious. He had watched Ethan build something extraordinary from nothing, not through inheritance, not through connection, but through a quality Martin had recognized immediately and had never found a precise legal term for. A quality that looked like confidence from a distance and looked, up close, like a man who was simply constitutionally incapable of accepting that something he believed in could fail. Martin had loved him in the careful, professional way that men of his generation loved the people they most admired, without saying it, without demonstrating it, but with a loyalty that had felt, until 3 years ago, like the most solid thing in his life. Ethan's father, Richard Hawthorne, had died 18 months before the accident. In his final weeks, Richard had called Martin to his bedside and said, with the directness of a man who had no time remaining for indirection, "Promise me you'll protect him, not the company, him, Ethan. He trusts too easily the people he loves. I've always been afraid of that." Martin had promised. He had believed at the time that he was capable of keeping it. He sat now in his car outside the mansion gates, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel in the blue-gray light of early evening. The gates were lit from below, their gold insignia glowing against the darkening sky. He had parked here in this exact spot every evening for 3 years before driving home, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 40, always alone, always engine off. Always holding the same weight in his chest that he couldn't put down and couldn't carry any further. His phone sat on the passenger seat, open to a blank message, a contact name at the top that he had typed and deleted so many times the muscle memory of it lived in his thumbs, now independently of his conscious decision. Ethan Hawthorne, private cell. Still active, still ringing, presumably. Martin had never tested it because testing it would have meant choosing, and for 3 years he had been trapped in the paralysis of someone who could see both sides of a choice with devastating clarity and lacked the courage that seeing clearly should have produced. He knew what Ryan had done. He had known within 48 hours of the accident. The official report had described wet road conditions, brake failure, and a tragic loss of vehicle control on a private mountain road. Martin had reviewed the report, noted its conclusions, and prepared to accept them, until a private security technician employed by Hawthorne Technologies' Corporate Protection Division had quietly slid a USB drive across a restaurant table and said, with his eyes on his coffee cup, "The system pulled footage from the private road cameras before anyone knew to wipe them. I made a copy. I don't know what to do with it. I thought you might." Martin had watched the footage once, alone in his home office at 2 in the morning. He had watched it only once because once was enough. The skid marks on the recorded footage were not consistent with brake failure in wet conditions. They were consistent with brakes that had performed normally, and then, at a precise point on the road, had performed not at all. The transition between the two was too sudden, too absolute, too clean to be mechanical degradation. It was the signature of a cut line, a deliberate severance, an act that required both mechanical knowledge and advance access to the vehicle. Ryan had driven out to the estate the afternoon, before the accident, to drop off documents for Ethan's signature. He had been alone with the car for 11 minutes while Ethan was inside. Martin had locked the USB drive in his private safe and not told a single person in the world what was on it, because Ryan had looked at him across a hospital waiting room the morning after the accident, while Ethan was still in surgery, and said in a voice barely above a murmur, "I know you've always taken care of this family, Martin. I intend to make sure that continues. I just need to know that we're on the same side." He had known with absolute certainty what those words meant. He had said nothing. He had told the police the brakes had failed. He had signed the report. He had watched Ryan step smoothly into the executive chairman's seat and begin reshaping the company in ways that would have made Ethan unrecognizable to it within 5 years. He had processed document after document that transferred authority, restructured holdings, and systematically dismantled the legal protections Ethan had built around his own controlling interest. And he had told himself each time that Ethan might still recover, that the paralysis was not permanent, that there would be a moment when he could correct this. 3 years had passed. Ethan had not recovered. The moment had not come. And last week, Martin had watched Ethan blink twice, slow, deliberate, unmistakable, during a routine document signing while Ryan was describing, in his pleasant and practiced way, a share transfer that would have made Ethan a minority stakeholder in his own company. He had remembered, suddenly and completely, what the double blink meant. "Whenever I blink twice during a meeting, it usually means someone isn't telling the truth." Ethan had said it years ago, over chess, laughing as he said it, treating it like a charming quirk. "My father taught me. He said the body knows before the mind admits." Ethan had been blinking twice for 3 years. And for 3 years, Martin had looked away every time. He picked up his phone now and typed 4 words into the blank message field, with the slow, deliberate pressure of someone writing a confession they do not yet have the courage to send. "The brakes were cut, Ethan." He stared at the words for a long time. Then he deleted them. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel again. The mansion gates glowed in front of him, gold on darkness, beautiful and impenetrable. Inside his jacket pocket, folded into a small square and worn soft at the edges from handling, was a piece of paper he had been carrying for 6 weeks, ever since he'd begun researching what the medication nurse Linda administered was doing to Ethan's neurological function. He had not commissioned the research officially. He had contacted an old university colleague, a retired neurologist who owed him a favor, and described the drug regimen without identifying the patient. His colleague had called back within 3 days. The response had not been clinical and measured, the way Martin had expected. It had been urgent, and the urgency had frightened him in a way that very little still could. Martin, whoever is on this regimen, has been experiencing induced anterograde amnesia, the inability to form new long-term memories, not as a side effect, as the intended outcome. Combined with the dozing schedule you described, the patient would be cognitively present enough to perform tasks and respond to questions, but would retain no reliable memory of having done so. Legally, this would make any document they signed during the treatment period extremely vulnerable to challenge, if anyone withstanding chose to challenge it. Do you understand what I'm telling you? This isn't medicine. This is erasure. Martin understood. He had understood since the beginning. In some part of himself, he had been refusing to consult. He started the engine and pulled away from the gates. Behind him, on the second floor of the mansion, Ethan Hawthorne sat facing the window in the last of the evening light, watching Martin's car disappear down the private road, with the patient attention of a man who had learned that the people most likely to help him were precisely the ones most visibly destroying themselves with the burden of what they knew. Martin would come to him. Not yet, but soon. Something was accelerating inside this house. He could feel it the way he had always felt shifts in the architecture of a situation, the subtle redistribution of pressure that preceded a structural collapse. Something or someone had disturbed the careful equilibrium that Ryan had spent 3 years constructing. He suspected, with a certainty he could not yet explain, that it had something to do with a maid who sub-vocalized pharmaceutical names to herself in empty corridors. He let the thought settle. And waited. Ryan Hawthorne poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal glass, held it up to the light of his private study, and did not drink it. He never drank when he was thinking seriously. The whiskey was prop and ritual, something he had developed in the years he spent watching Ethan run meetings, noticing that his cousin always held a glass of water he rarely sipped, using the container as an anchor while his mind worked at speeds the room couldn't follow. Ryan had learned a great deal from watching Ethan, perhaps more than Ethan had ever suspected. That was, after all, how Ryan had survived 36 years in the shadow of someone whose talent was simply larger than his own. He was not unintelligent. He understood this about himself with the clarity of a man who had done the honest accounting early in life and made peace with the results. He was competent, strategic, charming, and entirely willing to be ruthless when competence and charm ran out. These were useful qualities. In a different family, in a different life, they might have built something respectable on their own terms. But he had been born into the Hawthorne family, which meant he had been born into Ethan's orbit. And Ethan's orbit, for everyone who occupied it, was a place where your own light was perpetually relative, always measured against the blinding central source, always found somewhat wanting. Ryan had decided, when he was 19 and Ethan was 20, and already building the prototype of the software that would eventually become Hawthorne Technologies, that he would not spend his life being found wanting. He had simply needed to wait for the right moment. He set the whiskey glass down on his desk and unlocked the private study door to admit his head of security, a man named Crane who had worked for the family for 8 years, and whose most valuable quality was that he had long since made peace with the distinction between legality and instruction. "Report," Ryan said. Crane remained standing, the way he always did. He was not invited to sit in this office. The maid was reassigned after the incident outside Mr. Hawthorne's room this afternoon. "I'm aware. I watched the footage." Linda believes she saw the requisition form. "I know what Linda believes." Ryan turned toward the window, his back to the room. From here he could see the east wing, its lights burning amber against the darkening grounds. Linda's belief is accurate. The girl read it. I saw her lips move. A pause. "Do you want her removed from the property?" "No," Ryan's voice was immediate. If we remove her now, we've confirmed that what she saw mattered. She goes to someone, a family member, a friend, someone she trusts, and she describes what she read. Uprooted suspicion is more dangerous than contained curiosity. He turned back to the room. I want daily reports. I want to know who she contacts, where she goes when she leaves, what she tells people. I want her watched closely enough that if she becomes a problem, I know before she does. Crane nodded. And the dosage issue Linda flagged this morning. She says Mr. Hawthorne appeared more alert than usual. Something shifted in Ryan's expression, not quite fear, not quite recognition, something in between. Increase the morning administration by 15%, he said, and tell Linda that if she flags concerns to me by speaking them aloud in that corridor again, she can join the maid in the laundry wing. Crane left. Ryan stood alone in the silence of his study, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that was not the practiced ease of a man in control. It was briefer than guilt and more complex than regret, and it disappeared quickly, the way a reflection disappears when you turn away from the mirror. He walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, not the visible one, with its organized folders and correspondence, but the concealed compartment beneath it, accessible only by pressing a specific point on the drawer's interior paneling. His father, the previous Hawthorne patriarch before Richard, had installed it during a paranoid phase of his life. Ryan had always found the theater of it slightly absurd. He did not find it absurd now, he found it necessary. Inside the compartment, resting on a piece of dark velvet that someone, he could not now remember who, had placed there as though the object deserved ceremony, sat a damaged wristwatch. It was not an expensive watch. That had always struck Ryan as meaningful in a way he had never quite resolved. Ethan, who could have worn timepieces worth more than most people's houses, had worn this one, a simple steel-cased watch with a dark leather band, purchased from an ordinary watchmaker on the Lower East Side of the city during the first year he was building his company. He had told Ryan once, in a moment of rare sentimentality, that he wore it because it had been the first thing he'd bought with money he had earned entirely by himself. Not inherited, not borrowed, earned. Every time I look at it, Ethan had said, I remember who I actually am, not the company, not the money, just the person who earned it. The glass was cracked in a jagged diagonal line. The leather band was stiff and dark at the edges with dried blood that had never been cleaned away. The time, frozen at the moment of impact, read 11:47. Ryan stared at it. The watch had not been found at the accident site. It had not been recovered from the wreckage, not listed in the personal effects inventory, not included in the documentation that the Hawthorne estate had received from the highway patrol in the days following the crash. It had been in Ryan's car. Not because he had taken it, because Ethan had removed it and set it on Ryan's dashboard during the afternoon visit, 2 hours before the accident, while they were reviewing documents at the estate. He had said he was having the band replaced and didn't want to risk losing it. He had asked Ryan to drop it at the watchmaker's the following day. Ryan had never taken it to the watchmaker. Because 11 hours later, Ethan had driven off a mountain road in the rain, and what happened next had made the watch's origin, Ryan's car, Ryan's possession, Ryan's custody, a detail of annihilating significance. If anyone had ever established that the brakes had been cut, and if anyone had ever traced Ryan's presence at the vehicle that afternoon, and if anyone had ever produced a personal item belonging to Ethan that had been in Ryan's possession before the accident, the combination would have been enough. Ryan had understood this immediately. He had kept the watch in a safe deposit box for the first year, before moving it to this concealed drawer, before beginning to understand that having it near him was not sentimentality or carelessness, but something else entirely. Something he had never said aloud, not even to himself, but that lived in the precise way he held the watch each evening, not with triumph, not with cold satisfaction, but with a quality that resembled, distantly and reluctantly, the posture of someone doing penance. He placed it back on the velvet, closed the drawer, poured the whiskey into the small sink behind the desk. Outside his office window, the east wing lights burned on in the darkness, and somewhere behind those lit windows, his cousin, the man he had grown up with, had competed with, had envied with a ferocity that had curdled over decades into something irreversible, sat in his wheelchair and stared at the world with eyes that Ryan was beginning to suspect were far more awake than they were supposed to be. The thought arrived without drama, the way the most dangerous realizations always do. He needed this resolved before it became something he could no longer control. He needed it resolved soon. Grace had not intended to fall asleep. She had been awake for 21 consecutive hours by the time she was sent, through a miscommunication between the laundry wing supervisor and the second-floor duty roster, to sit with Ethan Hawthorne for a period of no more than 20 minutes. Nurse Linda had received an urgent call, something relating to medication delivery. The details communicated in a low, fast voice that Grace caught only fragments of, and the standard protocol required that Ethan not be left unsupervised. The duty housekeeper was occupied with a family matter on the ground floor. 2 other staff members were running behind on their evening tasks. Grace happened to be standing at the end of the corridor with an armful of fresh towels she had already delivered once and been turned away with, and Margaret Collins, arriving at a practical decision faster than she would have liked, had pointed at her and said, 20 minutes. Do not touch anything. Do not ask him questions. If he needs anything, come and find me immediately. Grace had nodded and entered. The room was larger than her entire apartment. That was the first thing that struck her every time she was near it, not as resentment, simply as a fact of geometry that required a moment to absorb. Floor-to-ceiling windows along the far wall looked out over private gardens lit softly from below, the fountains and sculpted hedgerows glowing in the evening dark like something from an architectural magazine. The medical equipment along one wall was so seamlessly integrated into the room's design, cream and brushed steel, nothing clinical or institutional, that it took training to recognize it as equipment at all. Ethan sat in his motorized wheelchair facing the window, as he apparently always did in the evenings. His back was to the door. His reflection was visible in the dark glass, and even reflected and reversed, even reduced to a mirror image, the quality of the face was striking. He had been extraordinarily handsome before the accident, in the way that men with absolute self-possession sometimes were not carefully arranged beauty, but the kind that came from someone who had never needed to use it as a tool and so wore it without awareness. 3 years had changed the architecture of it, sharpened the jaw, hollowed the temples slightly, pressed something ancient into the eyes. Grace set her towels on the chair near the door, the way Margaret had directed her to, and sat in the visitor's chair beside the bed. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the window. She intended to remain precisely like this for 20 minutes and then return to the laundry wing and never think again about unlabeled syringes or blank diagnosis lines or the specific quality of fear in a nurse's voice. She lasted approximately 4 minutes before her body simply overruled her. She was 24 years old and she had worked 11 hours, cared for her mother through an early morning nausea episode before the shift, packed Noah's school bag, walked the 4 blocks from the bus stop because the card was low, and had eaten exactly 1 meal, a small container of rice she'd packed from home that had seemed like enough at 7 in the morning and had not been enough at noon. She did not feel herself fall asleep. One moment she was sitting upright, watching the reflection of Ethan Hawthorne in the window glass, noting the stillness of him and thinking, with the detached observational quality of someone too tired to attach feeling to thoughts, that he held himself with extraordinary dignity for a person the world had decided was broken. The next moment, her head had dropped forward slightly, her body had listed to the left, and her left hand, acting entirely on the nursing student's instinct that she had never managed to deprogram, had settled on the edge of the bed and come to rest against Ethan's hand in the automatic, practiced gesture of someone taking a resting pulse. Not holding his hand, simply touching it, the way a person leans on the nearest solid thing when they are no longer fully conscious of their own weight. She was asleep before her fingers finished settling. Ethan had known she was falling asleep for at least 90 seconds before it happened. He had watched her reflection in the window, her head dropping by degrees, her shoulders releasing their professional tension in stages, the particular quality of a body surrendering to a fatigue too complete to negotiate with. He had not called for help. He had not reached for the emergency call button beside his chair. He had watched. He had watched because in 3 years, no one had ever fallen asleep in this room out of something as simple as exhaustion. People performed in this room, performed concern, performed affection, performed medical care, performed legal formality. Even the brief periods of genuine quiet that occasionally descended were themselves a kind of performance, orchestrated rests between acts. This was not performance. This was a young woman so completely depleted that her body had simply voted without consulting her, and the only thing her unconscious had done, the one reflexive, unthought gesture she had produced, was reach for his hand. Not for a signature, not for a pulse reading to report, not for any purpose that served anyone in this house. Out of some trained instinct toward care that her body still practiced, even when her mind was off. Ethan looked down at her hand, resting against his. He thought about the 8 people who had told him, in various medical and psychological framings, that he was unlikely to ever feel genuine emotional response again, that the combination of physical trauma and prolonged pharmaceutical management had compromised the neural pathways associated with effective processing. He had believed them, in the way that a person believes the last diagnosis after the previous ones have all proven insufficient. He had filed the information away and arranged his existence around it. He looked at this young woman sleeping in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted at an angle that was going to be painful when she woke, her worn uniform pressed but faded, her hands bearing the specific roughness of someone who worked with cleaning products all day and moisturized at night out of old professional habit. He had no words for what moved in his chest. He had, after all, been told he was no longer capable of the movement. The corner of his mouth lifted. Small, uncertain, real. It was the first smile Hawthorne Mansion had seen from Ethan in 3 years, arriving not in a moment of triumph, not in response to anything that should have produced it, not as a performance of recovery for someone who needed to believe he was improving, but in the simple, unguarded presence of someone who had asked for nothing and given, without knowing she was giving it, the one thing 3 years of expensive treatment had entirely failed to provide. Proof that he was still capable of being moved. Grace woke 12 minutes later, disoriented, then immediately mortified in the specific, electric way of someone who has just understood exactly where they are and exactly what they have done. Mr. Hawthorne, I am so sorry. She was on her feet before the sentence finished, straightening her uniform, her face flushing deeply. I should never have. I'll find Margaret immediately and explain. She stopped, because he was still smiling, and his eyes, sharp, blue, and entirely, unmistakably awake, were fixed on her with an intensity that was nothing like the vacancy she had been warned to expect. Grace stood very still. Mr. Hawthorne, she said quietly after a moment. You sub-vocalize pharmaceutical names when you read them, he said. His voice was rougher than she had expected, hoarse from disuse, as though his vocal cords had been only occasionally employed for years and had retained the capacity but lost the smoothness. But it was clear, unhesitating, the voice of a man in complete possession of what he was saying. I'm sorry. Outside the room this afternoon, when you read the document, your lips moved. He held her gaze. I read lips in 3 languages. I know the name you read. I know what it does. The blood drained from Grace's face. Mr. Hawthorne, you fell asleep holding my hand, he said quietly, because you were too exhausted to do anything else. Not because you wanted something. Not because someone told you to. He paused. In 3 years, you are the first person who has touched my hand and wanted nothing from it. Grace could not speak for a moment. Everyone wants something, she finally said very softly. I've just never learned how to ask. Neither have I, Ethan replied. Not since I learned that everyone who says they love me is waiting for me to die. The words settled between them, with the weight of something that had been held a long time before being set down. Grace looked toward the door, the closed, mahogany-surveilled door, and then back at him. What is happening in this house? She asked. Ethan's voice dropped to a level below the range of the room's audio monitoring system, a frequency he had identified, through 3 years of careful observation, as the precise boundary of the devices Ryan had installed. I don't fully know yet, he said, but I know the accident that put me in this chair was not an accident. I know the medication I've been given has nothing to do with recovery, and I know that whoever is responsible is still inside these walls, still smiling at me every single morning. He met her eyes. And now that they've seen you sitting beside me, now that there is footage of you in this room, of me smiling, you are not safe either. Grace did not sleep that night. She arrived home to find Noah already in bed, and her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water she had not drunk, waiting with the specific patience of someone who had learned that worrying served no practical purpose, but had not yet learned how to stop. Emily Carter's face had changed significantly over the 2 years of illness. Not aged, exactly, but refined. The way things are refined by sustained heat, stripped down to a truer and more essential version of themselves. She was 48 and looked both older and more precisely herself, the illness having removed the softness that fatigue and ordinary living had once padded over her actual face. You're late, Emily said. I know, I'm sorry. Grace kissed her mother's forehead and moved to the kitchen. Have you eaten? Margaret brought something from next door. Margaret is 73 and shouldn't be climbing stairs. Margaret disagrees. Grace smiled despite everything, putting the kettle on because the ritual of it settled her, because her hands needed something to do. She made tea she would not drink and stood at the kitchen counter looking at the small, laminated photograph of her father that had lived on the windowsill since his death 5 years ago. Daniel Carter, quiet man, precise in his movements, careful with his words, devoted to his family in the way that some people are devoted to things they know are irreplaceable. He had called her his little observer because she had always noticed details, a habit, he used to say, that she had inherited directly from him. He had died in a car accident on a rainy highway when Grace was 19. She had accepted this without question because there was nothing at the time to question. Police report, insurance settlement, closed casket because the impact had been significant. She had grieved, and then she had continued, because she had a mother and a small brother, and grief was not something that paused the bills. She thought of him now because she could not stop thinking of Ethan's words. The accident that put me in this chair was not an accident. She carried her tea to the small table in the corner of her room, the one where she did her accounts, where she had once spread her nursing textbooks, where she now kept her mother's medical paperwork and her own household budget in a series of carefully labeled folders. She reached for the folder labeled Personal, Dad, which contained his employment records, the insurance documents, the few official papers she had gathered after the accident and never fully organized. She was not sure why she reached for it. Perhaps the same instinct that had made her read the pharmaceutical document this morning. Perhaps something looser and less definable. The kind of gravitational pull that moves a person toward a thing they don't yet understand they need to find. She found the badge near the bottom of the folder, tucked behind his death certificate and a folded insurance summary. In a plain white envelope she did not recognize from any of her previous handling of these papers. She did not understand immediately. She read it a second time, the way she had read the pharmaceutical document, carefully, with the specific attention of someone who has learned not to trust her first interpretation of important information. Daniel Carter, Senior Security Consultant, Hawthorne Technologies. Her father had worked for Hawthorne Technologies. Her father, who had told his family he worked in corporate security for a private technology firm, who had never, not once, mentioned a name, had worked for the same company whose founder was now sitting in a wheelchair behind medicated doors in the most guarded room Grace had ever cleaned. She sat with this for a long time. Then she found the newspaper clipping tucked behind the badge, old and soft at the folds, printed on paper that had already begun its slow yellow descent, and her breath left her body entirely. The article was dated exactly 3 years and 2 months ago, 1 month before Ethan Hawthorne's accident. It reported a fatal collision on a private mountain highway, a stretch of road that Grace had passed on a bus twice since beginning her employment at the mansion, that wound up toward the private estates overlooking the city. The same road. She read her father's name in the 3rd paragraph. She read the official cause: wet road conditions, brake failure, loss of vehicular control. She set the clipping down on the table and stared at the laminated photograph on the windowsill. Her father's face smiled back at her, the careful, precise, devoted face of a man who had known something he hadn't told his family, who had worked for a company in secret, who had died on the same road that Ethan Hawthorne had nearly died on, 1 month earlier, in an accident described in language so similar to Ethan's own police report that the symmetry was not coincidence. It was template. Someone had used the same method, on the same road, and described it with the same language: wet conditions, brake failure, because the person constructing the cover story had either not considered that both accidents might one day be read side by side, or had been so confident they never would be that they hadn't bothered to vary the language. Grace's hands were trembling now. She pressed them flat against the table. Her father had been a security consultant for Hawthorne Technologies. He had died 1 month before Ethan's accident, and Grace Carter, his daughter, with no money and no connections and no reason in the world to be standing in that specific mansion, had been hired as a maid 3 years later and placed in the East Wing corridor immediately outside Ethan Hawthorne's room. She thought about what Ethan had told her this evening. "You are not safe either." And then she thought about something else, something that had arrived quietly, without drama, in the back of her mind while she'd been staring at the badge. She had not applied for the Hawthorne Mansion position independently. The job listing had come to her through a domestic staffing agency whose name she had found on a community board at the dialysis center, on a flyer that had been placed there at some point between one of her mother's appointments. She had never thought to question the coincidence. She was questioning it now. She had not found this job. It had found her. The question that followed was the one that would not let her sleep for the remaining hours of the night, that sat behind her eyes while she lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, that walked with her to the bus stop in the gray early morning and rode beside her all the way to the mansion gates. Had she been placed in that house to be watched? Or had she been placed there to be used? And if her father had died, protecting a secret that Ryan Hawthorne could not afford to surface? Had she just walked, unknowingly, into the same trap that had killed him? Ryan had not slept either. He had spent the hours between midnight and dawn in his private study, reviewing surveillance footage and financial projections, with the focused, airless concentration of a man who understood that the margin between success and catastrophe had just narrowed significantly and required immediate attention. The footage from Ethan's room was the problem. Not because Ryan was sentimental. He had made his peace long ago with the specific emotional mathematics of what he had done, the accounting of it, the justification of it, the construction of a version of events in which he was not a villain, but simply a man who had understood a situation more clearly than anyone else and acted accordingly. He was good at that accounting. He had been doing it for 36 years. The problem was strategic. The smile. 3 years of pharmaceutical management, careful dosage calibration, and legal document architecture had been predicated on a single essential foundation: the world's belief that Ethan Hawthorne was no longer cognitively or emotionally present in any meaningful sense, that the accident had damaged not just his body but the essential animating quality of him, the intelligence, the perception, the capacity to notice and respond and remember. The board believed it. The family believed it. The courts had accepted it in the legal capacity assessments that transferred executive authority to Ryan. The smile destroyed the foundation. Not because one expression was legally significant, but because it was on camera, and because the person who had produced it in Ethan was the same person who had been standing in the corridor reading pharmaceutical documents 6 hours earlier. Ryan had watched the footage 17 times. He had watched Ethan's eyes specifically. The eyes of a man who was cognitively absent did not move the way Ethan's eyes moved in those 11 minutes of footage. They did not track. They did not process. They did not, at the end, when Grace woke and stood and began apologizing, look at her with the specific, precise, fully inhabited attention of a man doing something he hadn't done in 3 years. Listening. Not hearing, listening. The distinction was observable and damning. Ryan picked up his secure phone and made 3 calls before sunrise. The first was to Nurse Linda. He told her that the morning dosage was to increase by 20%, not 15%, and that if Ethan showed any further signs of unusual alertness, she was to administer the secondary compound without waiting for the scheduled time. Linda said nothing for 3 full seconds before saying yes, and Ryan noted the silence and filed it in the part of his mind that tracked people approaching their limits. The second call was to his corporate attorney, not Martin Doyle, whom Ryan had not trusted with anything genuinely sensitive for 18 months, but a secondary firm he maintained for the specific category of legal work that required someone with no pre-existing relationship to the Hawthorne family and no conscience that might complicate billing. He needed the final share transfer document prepared and ready for signature within 48 hours. Once that signature was obtained, Ethan's controlling interest was gone. Ryan's authority over the company became structural rather than delegated. No subsequent recovery, medical, legal, or otherwise, could reverse it. 48 hours. The third call was the one that cost him something, though he would not have used that word. "I need you to find out everything about a woman named Grace Carter," he said to Crane. "I mean everything. Her father, her mother's medical situation, her brother, her finances, anyone she's contacted since she was hired. I want to know what she cares about most." A pause. "Everyone has a pressure point. Find hers." He ended the call and stood at the window of his study, watching the sunrise begin its slow architecture over the Hawthorne grounds. The gardens lightening from blue-black to gray to the gold that the mansion's exterior photography always tried to capture and never quite did. He thought about his cousin. He thought about the watch in the drawer. He thought about a rainy night 3 years ago when he had stood at a window very much like this one, waiting for a phone call that had taken longer than expected, and had felt not guilt, because guilt required a belief in alternatives, and Ryan had become, by then, convinced that no genuine alternatives existed but something. A heaviness, a finality, the specific weight of a door that has closed behind you. He had chosen to interpret it, then and afterward, as the weight of responsibility. The burden of being the person willing to do what was necessary when others were not. He chose to interpret it the same way now. Downstairs in the East Wing, Ethan was being given his morning injection. The dosage was 20% above what Linda had already been administering, a level that would, his colleague had told Martin Doyle, produce significant sedative effect in combination with the existing compound while appearing, to a casual observer, to be routine medical care. But Ethan had been preparing for this. He had been preparing for 3 days, since the moment he first heard Grace subvocalize the drug name and understood, with complete clarity, what was being done to him. He had been using every hour of relative alertness, every window between doses when the fog thinned, to accomplish something that required no physical capability, no movement, no cooperation from a body that had been made into his prison. He had been building a record in his mind. Dates, document descriptions, signature requests he had been guided through while too medicated to read the text, faces and voices and the specific language of people who believed they were speaking to someone incapable of retaining what they said. He had retained everything. He retained it now as the injection entered his arm, and the familiar heaviness began at the edges of his vision. He blinked twice slowly in the direction of the door. In the hallway, passing with her cart on the way to the laundry wing, Grace Carter saw it through the 4-inch gap that had been left again, at a wheelchair's height. She stopped. She looked at the gap, at the angle, at the deliberateness of a door left open at precisely that height by a man who could not move freely through a room. She had read, in her nursing studies, that patients with severe mobility limitations sometimes developed extraordinary compensatory strategies, ways of communicating, of manipulating their environment, of maintaining agency through whatever means remained available to them. She looked at the double blink. She did not yet know what it meant, but she filed it with the precision of someone who had spent her life knowing that small details, noticed and retained, were sometimes the only power available to people without any other kind. She pushed her cart forward. Ryan, watching the corridor feed on his study monitor, noted the pause. His jaw tightened. 48 hours. He could manage 48 hours. The envelope had no stamp and no return address. It arrived on Martin Doyle's private office desk on a Wednesday morning, slid beneath his door sometime between his departure the previous evening and his arrival at 7:15. A window, during which the building was cleaned by a rotating staff, he had never paid close attention to. It was a plain white envelope with his name written on the front in handwriting he did not immediately recognize, though something about its particular precision, the careful, slightly compressed letters of someone accustomed to writing in small spaces, nagged at a memory he couldn't immediately place. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top in the same handwriting, my father was Daniel Carter, Senior Security Consultant, Hawthorne Technologies. He died 3 years and 2 months ago on the same road in an accident described with identical language to the one that paralyzed Ethan Hawthorne. I have his employment badge. I have the newspaper clipping. I have been placed in this house by an agency I did not seek out. I believe I was put here deliberately. I believe you know why. I believe you want to do the right thing and haven't yet found a way to do it. I'm giving you a reason. At the bottom, Grace Carter, East Wing, laundry reassignment. No phone number, no meeting request, nothing that could be used against her if the letter were intercepted. Just evidence, and an appeal to a conscience she had correctly identified as not entirely dead. Martin read it standing behind his desk, still in his overcoat, the door barely closed behind him. He read it twice. Then he sat down in his chair with the slow, effortful movement of someone lowering a significant weight. Daniel Carter. The name arrived in his memory with the full weight of everything attached to it. He had known Daniel Carter. Not well, Daniel had been a consultant, not a permanent staff member, and he operated in the security division's upper tier, which dealt with corporate espionage risk and executive protection rather than facility management. But Martin had reviewed his contract. He had seen the file. He had known, after the accident, that Daniel Carter had been one of 3 people outside the executive team who had access to the company's most sensitive internal documents. The financial audits, the offshore account records, the evidence of the irregularities that Ethan had been calling Ryan about on the night of the crash. He had not known Daniel Carter was dead. He had not known because he had not asked. He was beginning to understand, sitting in his office in the gray Wednesday morning light, that the list of things he had chosen not to ask about had grown so long it constituted a kind of architecture, a structure of deliberate not knowing built to make his silence feel passive rather than active, an oversight rather than a choice. He took the folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, the neurologist's report, worn soft at the edges from 6 weeks of handling, and laid it on the desk beside Grace's letter. Cognitive compliance compounds, anterograde amnesia as an intended outcome, documents signed under conditions that would make them legally vulnerable to challenge if anyone with standing chose to challenge them. Ethan had standing. And if he was as cognitively present as that smile on the footage suggested, footage Martin had not seen, but that Crane had mentioned to a building security contractor who had mentioned it at a lunch Martin had attended on Tuesday. The chain of gossip, inside Hawthorne Mansion being a river that eventually found every shore. Then the medication had not done what it was designed to do, or it had done it incompletely. Or Ethan Hawthorne was simply a more remarkable person than the compounds had anticipated. Martin had believed, at 19, that he would become the kind of lawyer who stood for something. He had written it in an essay for his law school application, the specific, earnest language of a young man who genuinely intended it. He had framed the first case he'd won on his office wall and had looked at it every day for 22 years as a reminder of the version of himself he had promised to be. He looked at it now. Then he opened his private safe. The USB drive was exactly where he had left it, inside a small fireproof box beneath the combination document, untouched for 3 years. He held it in his palm for a moment, the small, plain, annihilating object that contained footage of an accident that was not an accident. He picked up his phone. He did not dial Ethan's number. The call would be monitored. He typed a message to his retired neurologist colleague instead, using a secondary messaging application they had both used in law school. I need to meet. Today. The patient I described. I need you to prepare a formal clinical assessment. I'll explain everything in person. He sent it before the part of him that had chosen silence for 3 years could intervene. Then he stood, put on his overcoat again, walked to the window and looked out at the city for a long moment. He thought about Richard Hawthorne's last request. Promise me you'll protect him, not the company, him. He had failed that promise for 3 years. He understood now, with the clarity that sometimes arrives very late and is not diminished by its lateness, that there was still time to keep it. But barely. He turned from the window and began writing. Not a memo, not a legal brief, a statement, the kind that courts accepted as foundational testimony, the kind that required a signatory to swear to its truthfulness under penalty of perjury, the kind that, once filed with the right office by the right attorney, became a matter of public record that could not be quietly buried. He wrote for 4 hours without stopping. He described everything. The footage from the private road camera, Ryan's words in the hospital waiting room, the documents he had processed that transferred Ethan's authority, the medication regimen he had subsequently investigated, Daniel Carter's name, included in the footnotes of an internal security memo he had processed 18 months ago and dismissed without follow-up. All of it, the entire architecture of what he had chosen not to see, reconstructed now with the full, precise, prosecutorial clarity of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how truth was established and had decided, finally, to use that knowledge for its original purpose. When he finished, he printed 2 copies. One he placed in the fireproof box with the USB drive. The second he folded, placed in a plain white envelope, and addressed in his careful, compressed handwriting to a person he had never met but whose name appeared in the footnotes of Daniel Carter's internal security file as a standing emergency contact. A designation that, in the corporate security world, meant, if something happens to me and you receive this, you'll know what to do with it. He wrote Grace Carter's apartment address on the envelope. He had looked it up that morning. He had known, reading her letter, that she was already more prepared for this than she understood. The revenge Ethan Hawthorne had built in his mind was not the kind that looked like revenge from the outside. It did not look like fury. It did not look like confrontation. It did not, in its early stages, look like anything at all, because Ethan had understood, in the long months of enforced stillness that had followed the accident, that the specific disadvantage of his position required a specific kind of strategy. He could not move without assistance. He could not communicate without being monitored. He could not make a single decision about his own life without it being observed, reported, and if it appeared to threaten the arrangement Ryan had constructed, counteracted. What he could do was think, and plan, and wait for the precise moment when the architecture Ryan had built became vulnerable to a single, correct, devastating application of pressure. He had been waiting for 3 years. On the morning of the 48th hour, the deadline Ryan had set, though Ethan did not yet know its specific content, only its weight, which he could feel in the slightly increased urgency with which Ryan had entered his room the previous evening. 3 things happened in rapid succession that collapsed the waiting into action. The first, Grace arrived on his corridor at 7:15, not as an assigned duty, but as a deliberate deviation from her laundry wing schedule that she had accomplished by arriving early and offering to carry towels for the duty housekeeper, whose arthritis made the morning rounds difficult. She moved to the 4-inch gap in his door and spoke in a voice calibrated to precisely the frequency below the room's audio monitoring, a frequency she had identified through the same 3 years of clinical observation that Ethan had used, though she had been studying it for only 2 weeks and had been correct on the first attempt, which told him something significant about her. "My father worked for your company," she said. "He died on the same road, the same language in both police reports. The staffing agency that placed me here was advertised at my mother's dialysis center, a flyer that appeared between appointments. I think someone put me here to be close enough to watch. I think they underestimated what I would notice." A pause. "I think you've been waiting for someone who would notice." Ethan looked at her through the gap, at the face of a woman who had spent her adult life learning to survive in spaces that were not built for her, who had developed, through that sustained discipline, a quality that no amount of money had ever managed to manufacture in the people who surrounded him. Accuracy, the specific, unembellished accuracy of someone who could not afford to be wrong. "Your father," he said quietly, "came to my office 3 days before his accident. He had found evidence of offshore transfers, money leaving the company through a subsidiary that existed only on paper. He brought it to me because his security clearance meant he understood what it signified. I told him I would handle it. I called Ryan that evening." He paused. "I never connected the accidents until this moment." Grace was very still. "He died protecting that information." "Yes, the word cost him something. I'm sorry." The second thing that happened. Martin Doyle arrived at the mansion 40 minutes earlier than any scheduled appointment warranted, carrying a briefcase that was heavier than usual, and requested, through the front desk, an immediate meeting with the family attorney regarding an urgent matter requiring Ethan Hawthorne's direct attention. When the desk staff, trained to deflect such requests, explained that Mr. Hawthorne was not available for unscheduled meetings, Martin placed on the desk a single printed page bearing the letterhead of the court with jurisdiction over the Hawthorne estate and read from it, in his careful, unhurried 30-year attorney's voice, a section that used the words cognitive capacity assessment, independent medical review, and emergency injunctive relief. He had filed the paperwork at 8 o'clock that morning, before anyone in the mansion knew he was coming. The desk staff called Ryan. Ryan took the call in his study, where he had been reviewing the final share transfer document with his secondary attorney, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the specific cold sensation of a plan whose careful architecture was encountering something it had not been designed to accommodate. He told the desk staff to keep Martin in the entrance hall. He called Crane. Crane arrived at Martin's position in the entrance hall within 4 minutes and placed a hand on Martin's arm with the courteous, irresistible pressure of a large man who understood exactly how much force was implied in a gesture that appeared to be a gentle escort. "Mr. Doyle, if you'll come with me." "You can take your hand off my arm," Martin said pleasantly, "or I can make a phone call to the court officer who is currently holding a sealed copy of the document I filed this morning, a copy that will be opened if I do not check in within the next 30 minutes. Your choice." Crane took his hand off Martin's arm. The third thing that happened, and the one that broke the carefully maintained silence of 3 years in a way that nothing else could have. Nurse Linda, who had been awake all night composing and deleting a statement that she had finally, at 5 in the morning, simply printed and signed without rereading, because she knew that rereading it would give her the opportunity to lose her courage, walked into Ryan's study without knocking at 7:55, set the document on his desk, and said in a voice that had stopped shaking somewhere around page 3 of her 4-page statement, "I'm giving this to the independent physician the court has appointed. I've also sent a copy to my attorney. I should have done this 2 years ago." She walked out before Ryan could speak. He sat behind his desk and looked at the document. Then he looked at the share transfer papers his secondary attorney had prepared. 48 hours of work, 48 hours that had not been enough. He opened the bottom drawer. He picked up the watch. He held it for a long time, the cracked glass, the frozen hands, the blood-dark leather, and understood with the comprehensive clarity of a man who had always been good at reading situations and had simply, catastrophically misread this one, that the thing he had most underestimated was not Ethan's cognitive resilience, not Martin's belated conscience, not a retired neurologist's clinical assessment. It was a 24-year-old maid with worn shoes and nursing school instincts who had fallen asleep in the wrong room at the right moment and had decided, without calculating the personal cost, that some things could not be walked away from. He put the watch in his jacket pocket. He kneaded it where he could feel it. Upstairs, in the room with the 4-inch gap in the door, Ethan Hawthorne looked at Grace Carter through the morning light and said, in the quiet, measured voice of a man who had been planning this moment for 3 years and had learned to sound calm when he was anything but, "There is a digital ledger, hidden in the company's server architecture behind 3 layers of encryption I built myself before the accident. Every fraudulent transfer, every falsified document, every instruction Ryan gave and believed would disappear. I kept a parallel record, not on paper, not on any device Ryan had access to here." He touched his temple. "Every account number, every date, every amount. I have been constructing a criminal case in my own memory for 3 years, waiting for someone with the means and the standing to help me deliver it to the right people." He looked at her. "Your father died trying to get that information to me. I'm asking if you'll help me finish what he started." Grace stood in the doorway of the most expensive room she had ever entered, in a uniform that had been washed too many times. With worn shoes and no savings and a sick mother and a little brother who thought she worked in a beautiful hotel. She thought about the box of nursing textbooks under her bed. She thought about her father's careful, precise handwriting on documents he had never shown his family. She thought about the badge on the windowsill, and the newspaper clipping, and the way a crescent of dried blood on a watch was visible even through cracked glass if you knew to look. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet and entirely without hesitation. And somewhere in the legal system of the city, moving through court offices and independent medical boards and financial regulatory bodies, with the accelerating inevitability of something that had been building for 3 years, and had finally found the opening it needed, the process that would dismantle everything Ryan Hawthorne had constructed began to move. Not with a shout, not with drama, with paperwork, with testimony, with the specific, brutal, patient machinery of justice that grinds slowly, and when it finally reaches the thing it has been moving toward, grinds exceedingly fine. Ryan Hawthorne had spent 3 years building a prison around his cousin. He had not considered that prisons, by definition, are structures, and that all structures have a foundation. He had not considered that the foundation of his was a man he had underestimated, and a woman he had never seen coming. He would have 48 hours to consider it now. And then the doors he had locked would begin, one by one, to open from the inside. Part 3 coming, where the walls close in, the truth surfaces, and the revenge that has been building for 3 years finally arrives.